Sometimes the most powerful engines are the ones that never stop running, even when everything else begins to fail. That's what 75-year-old Robert Turner proved when he stood at the Family Feud podium, his voice weakened by ALS, but his spirit still revving at full throttle, and gave an answer that stopped Steve Harvey's heart and reminded an entire television studio what it means to cross the finish line with grace, dignity, and the unbreakable love between a father and his sons. The morning had started early in the Turner household, as mornings always did when your body was racing against time in ways you never wanted to understand. In the modest ranch house in Charlotte, North Carolina, Robert Turner sat in his recliner, slowly sipping coffee through a straw, while watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of the sunsets he used to see from the infield at Charlotte Motor Speedway during his 40-year career as a NASCAR mechanic. Robert's hands, once capable of rebuilding engines with precision that bordered on artistry, now trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. The progressive muscle weakness that came with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis had been stealing pieces of his physical independence for the past 2 years, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he first picked up a wrench at age 16 and discovered that he could make machines sing. At 75, Robert had been forced to accept realities that went against everything he had believed about strength, control, and the ability to fix whatever was broken. ALS doesn't respond to mechanical expertise or determination or the kind of problem-solving skills that had made Robert Turner legendary in the NASCAR garage circuit. It simply takes, gradually and relentlessly, until speaking becomes difficult, walking becomes impossible, and eventually, breathing requires assistance. But today was different from the routine of doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and the careful management of symptoms that had become Robert's new normal. Today, Robert was preparing for something that seemed impossible just months ago, appearing on Family Feud with his 3 sons, who had convinced him that this opportunity might be exactly what their family needed to create one more perfect memory before ALS took away his ability to participate in such adventures. The idea had originated with his middle son, Michael Turner, now 38, and a successful automotive engineer who credited his father with teaching him everything he knew about how machines work and why they sometimes don't. Michael had grown up in NASCAR garages, learning to read engine diagnostics before he could read chapter books, absorbing his father's philosophy that every mechanical problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough and think creatively enough to find it. Robert Turner had begun his automotive career in 1968, fresh out of high school, with an intuitive understanding of how machines worked. He had started as the lowest member of a NASCAR pit crew, fetching tools and cleaning parts, while watching veteran mechanics perform precision work that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. His breakthrough had come during the 1973 World 600, when Jack Morrison's favored car began experiencing mysterious power loss during practice. 3 experienced mechanics had examined the engine without finding the problem, and the team was considering withdrawing when Robert approached the crew chief with unusual confidence for someone so young. Robert had diagnosed a hairline crack in the intake manifold that was invisible but large enough to affect the air-fuel mixture. The crack had been exactly where he predicted, and the repair had allowed Morrison to finish 3rd in one of the season's most competitive races. Word of the young mechanic, who could diagnose problems that escaped veteran crews, had spread quickly through the NASCAR community. Over 4 decades, Robert had worked on cars for some of the most successful drivers in NASCAR history, earning respect for his technical expertise and calm professionalism. He had developed innovations in engine preparation that other crews studied and copied, and his diagnostic abilities had become legendary. But Robert's greatest pride had never been in trophies or industry recognition. His greatest pride had been in watching his 3 sons grow up in NASCAR garages, learning about precision, teamwork, and excellence in craft. David, the eldest, had been drawn to the business side of motorsports and had parlayed his garage education into successfully managing racing teams. Michael had followed his father's technical interests into automotive engineering, earning patents for innovations used throughout the racing industry. Christopher, the youngest, had become a respected racing journalist whose mechanical understanding made him knowledgeable about the sport. Each son had chosen different paths, but all carried forward lessons about preparation, attention to detail, and never giving up when faced with seemingly impossible problems. The irony of Robert's ALS diagnosis hadn't been lost on the Turner family. The man who had spent 40 years fixing everything that broke was now facing a biological problem that had no solution, no repair manual, no spare parts that could restore function. ALS attacks motor neurons, the nerve cells controlling voluntary muscle movement. As these neurons die, muscles gradually weaken and atrophy, typically beginning with extremities and progressing toward core muscles that control breathing. The disease's progression is irreversible and ultimately fatal, usually within 2 to 5 years. For someone whose identity had been built around control and precision, ALS represented a fundamental challenge to everything Robert believed about problem solving. This wasn't a mechanical issue that could be diagnosed and repaired. The early symptoms had been subtle: slight tremor in his right hand, occasional difficulty with fine motor tasks, disproportionate fatigue. It had been David who insisted their father see a doctor when Robert dropped a wrench 3 times while working on Christopher's car. The diagnostic process had been exhaustive and devastating. Robert underwent nerve conduction studies, electromyography tests, MRI scans, and blood tests designed to rule out other conditions. Each test eliminated alternatives while pointing toward the diagnosis the Turner family had hoped to avoid. The months following diagnosis had tested every lesson Robert had taught his sons about facing challenges with courage. Simple tasks that once required no thought began requiring conscious effort. Robert's speech began requiring more energy to express his thoughts. Perhaps most difficult had been the gradual role reversal within the Turner family. Robert found himself increasingly dependent on his son's assistance. David began handling financial affairs and medical appointments. Michael researched adaptive equipment. Christopher moved back to Charlotte to provide daily assistance. The Family Feud preparation had represented more than television appearance. It had been a chance for the Turner family to function as a team again, utilizing Robert's mental acuity while accommodating physical limitations ALS had imposed. The diagnosis had come 18 months ago, delivered by a neurologist whose clinical demeanor couldn't quite mask his sympathy for a family about to face one of medicine's most devastating realities. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the doctor had said, explaining that ALS attacks the nerve cells responsible for controlling voluntary muscle movement, gradually robbing patients of their ability to walk, speak, eat, and eventually breathe. The average life expectancy after ALS diagnosis is 2 to 5 years, the doctor had explained. Though some patients live longer, while others decline more rapidly, there is no cure, no treatment that significantly alters the disease's progression, no mechanical fix for a neurological system that has begun to shut down in ways that even Robert's expertise couldn't address. For a man whose identity had been built around solving problems and fixing what was broken, the diagnosis had been more than medically devastating, it had been existentially challenging. Robert Turner had spent his entire adult life believing that any machine could be repaired with the right tools, sufficient knowledge, and enough determination. ALS had forced him to confront the reality that some things cannot be fixed, only endured with as much grace and dignity as possible. But Robert's sons had seen something in their father that ALS couldn't touch, the same resilience, wisdom, and quiet strength that had sustained him through 4 decades of high-pressure mechanical challenges. They had watched him adapt his communication style as his speech became more labored, maintain his sense of humor as his mobility decreased, and continue to offer advice and guidance even as his physical capabilities diminished. The Family Feud opportunity had emerged from Christopher's observation that his father's face still lit up when Steve Harvey appeared on their television screen. Despite everything that ALS had taken from him, Robert still enjoyed the show's family-friendly competition, Steve's humor, and the joy of watching families work together to achieve common goals. "Dad always taught us that racing is about teamwork," Christopher had explained to the Family Feud casting directors during the application process. Even though he worked on engines, he understood that every person in the garage contributes to what happens on the track. He made us believe that families are like racing teams. Everyone has a role, everyone matters, and the best victories are the ones you achieve together. The preparation for Family Feud had been both challenging and therapeutic for the Turner family. Robert's speech had become increasingly affected by ALS, requiring more time and effort to communicate thoughts that had once flowed effortlessly. But the practice sessions had given him a sense of purpose and engagement that had been missing from his routine of medical appointments and symptom management. During their preparation, Robert's sons had been amazed by their father's continued mental acuity. His answers to practice survey questions were sharp, insightful, and often surprisingly clever. ALS had affected his ability to speak clearly, but it hadn't diminished his intelligence, humor, or competitive spirit that had made him successful in the high-stakes world of professional motorsports. The flight to Atlanta had been Robert's first time on an airplane since his diagnosis, requiring careful planning to accommodate his mobility limitations. David had handled the logistics with the same attention to detail that Robert had once applied to preparing race cars. Robert had insisted on wearing his vintage Charlotte Motor Speedway crew shirt for the taping, a garment that carried 40 years of memories and represented the career that had defined his approach to fatherhood. "Racing taught me everything I needed to know about being a dad," Robert had often told his sons. The Family Feud production team had been briefed about Robert's condition and had made accommodations to ensure he could participate comfortably. They had been warned that his speech might be slow and sometimes difficult to understand, but they had also been told that Robert Turner possessed a spirit that ALS hadn't touched. Steve Harvey's pre-show meeting with the Turner family was immediately different from his typical contestant interactions. Instead of the usual nervous energy, Steve encountered a group that seemed to understand they were participating in something more significant than a game show. They were creating a memory that would have to last. "Mr. Turner," Steve said, approaching Robert with obvious respect for the elderly man, whose physical frailty couldn't mask the strength of character that seemed to radiate from him. "Your sons tell me you spent 40 years working on race cars. That must have been quite a career." Robert looked up at Steve with eyes that still held the intensity and focus that had made him legendary among NASCAR crews. When he spoke, his words came slowly and with obvious effort, but his meaning was clear and his pride was unmistakable. "Best job in the world," Robert said, each word carefully articulated, despite the difficulty ALS had created with his speech muscles. "Got to work with my hands, solve problems, watch dreams come true." Steve was immediately struck by Robert's dignity and the obvious love and respect his sons showed their father. There was a story here that went deeper than automotive expertise, a legacy that had been built not just with wrenches and diagnostic equipment, but with patience, wisdom, and the kind of teaching that happens when a father shows his children that excellence is achieved through preparation, persistence, and working together toward common goals. "And what's the most important thing you taught these boys?" Steve asked, gesturing to David, Michael, and Christopher, who stood nearby with the kind of attentive respect that suggested their father's influence extended far beyond mechanical knowledge. Robert was quiet for a moment, gathering his energy for what he clearly considered an important response. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 40 years of fatherhood and the wisdom that comes from facing mortality with grace. "That every problem has a solution," he said slowly. "Sometimes you just need the right team to find it." The opposing family, the Martinez clan from Phoenix, had initially approached the competition with typical game show enthusiasm. But when they learned about Robert's condition and witnessed the obvious devotion between the Turner father and sons, their competitive energy transformed into something more respectful and supportive. This wasn't just about winning prizes. This was about honoring a man whose time for creating new memories was limited. When Steve Harvey took the stage with his characteristic energy, the studio buzzed with anticipation, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, a recognition that this episode would be special because of the quiet courage of the elderly man standing at the contestants' podium, supported by sons who understood they were participating in one of their final opportunities to compete alongside their father. The family introductions revealed the unique dynamic of the Turner team. Steve learned about Robert's 4-decade career in NASCAR, about sons who had followed their father's example of excellence and precision in their own careers, about a family that had faced ALS with the same teamwork and determination that had characterized their approach to every challenge they had encountered together. "Mr. Turner," Steve said during the introductions, 40 years in NASCAR. That's longer than some drivers' entire careers. What kept you passionate about the work for so long? Robert looked out at the studio audience, then at the cameras that would broadcast his words to millions of viewers, and his response carried the wisdom earned through decades of working in a profession where precision and teamwork often meant the difference between victory and disaster. Love, he said simply, the word requiring obvious effort, but carrying unmistakable conviction. Love for the machines, love for the sport, love for the people who trusted me to make their dreams possible. He paused, gathering energy for the rest of his thought. But mostly, love for these boys, who grew up thinking their dad could fix anything. The studio applauded, but Robert wasn't finished. With David's gentle assistance, he continued. Now they're taking care of the one thing I can't fix myself. The game began with the familiar energy of Family Feud, but Robert's presence seemed to elevate the entire experience beyond typical entertainment. During the first round, when the category was Name Something That Requires Patience, Robert buzzed in with surprising speed, despite his physical limitations, and slowly but clearly answered, Raising Good Sons. It was the #1 answer on the board. When it was Robert's turn to play during the third round, Steve approached the podium with obvious respect for the elderly mechanic. The category was Name Something That Gets Better with Age, and despite the effort required for him to speak, Robert's response was immediate and certain. Wisdom, he said. It was also the #1 answer. But it was during the fourth round that the moment everyone would remember forever finally arrived. The category was Name Something Fathers Miss Most, and after several family members had provided conventional answers like their children's childhood, family vacations, and bedtime stories, it was Robert's turn. Steve walked over to Robert's position at the podium, microphone in hand, and addressed the man who had spent 40 years teaching his sons that every challenge has a solution, if you're willing to work hard enough to find it. Mr. Turner, we need something fathers miss most. What do you think? Robert looked at Steve with eyes that had seen 4 decades of racing victories and defeats, that had watched his sons grow from curious boys in a garage to accomplished men with families of their own, that had learned to accept the reality that some problems don't have mechanical solutions. When Robert spoke, his words came slowly and with obvious effort, but they carried the weight of a father's love and the wisdom that comes from understanding that some experiences are too precious to ever truly be finished with. Driving with my sons one last time, he said. The words hung in the air with a weight that transcended typical game show responses. This wasn't just an answer about what fathers miss. This was a window into the heart of a man who was facing the reality that ALS would eventually take away his ability to do the things that had defined his relationship with his children. Steve Harvey, who had made his career by knowing how to respond to any situation, found himself completely speechless. The studio fell silent as everyone present recognized they had just heard something that went far beyond entertainment into the realm of profound human truth. Mr. Turner, Steve said quietly, setting his microphone down on the podium and walking directly to where Robert sat. That's not just an answer, that's every father's deepest truth. He positioned himself directly in front of Robert, speaking with the kind of respect that one father has for another. You know what you just did? You just reminded every dad in this studio, every dad watching at home, that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, and the best journeys are the ones we take with the people we love most. Steve turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the authority that comes from understanding something important. Ladies and gentlemen, this man right here spent 40 years making race cars go faster, perform better, win more races. But that's not his greatest achievement. His greatest achievement is raising 3 sons who understand that when life gets difficult, when things break down in ways that can't be fixed, you don't abandon the team, you stick together, you support each other, you find new ways to keep moving forward. The studio audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, but Steve wasn't finished. Mr. Turner, I want to do something for you, and I want your sons to help me. Steve gestured to David, Michael, and Christopher, who immediately joined their father and Steve in the center of the stage. You said you missed driving with your sons one last time. Well, we can't take you to Charlotte Motor Speedway right now, but we can do something else. Steve began walking slowly around the Family Feud set, and David, Michael, and Christopher flanked their father's wheelchair, creating a formation that resembled a racing team escorting their lead car. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced as they completed their lap around the stage, "Robert Turner's victory lap, 40 years of excellence, 3 champion sons, and a legacy that no disease can ever diminish." The studio erupted in the most sustained applause in Family Feud history, but it wasn't just applause, it was recognition, respect, and celebration of a man who had taught his sons that true victory isn't measured in trophies or prize money, but in the strength of the bonds you build with the people who matter most. As the victory lap concluded, Steve knelt down beside Robert's wheelchair and spoke directly to him. "Mr. Turner, you know what this proves? This proves that some races never really end. They just find new tracks, new ways to keep running, and as long as your boys are here, as long as they carry the lessons you taught them, you're still driving, you're still racing, you're still winning." Robert looked at Steve with tears in his eyes, then at his sons, who were surrounding him with protective attention. "Thank you," Robert said, the words requiring effort but carrying profound gratitude, for reminding us that champions are measured by who they love, not what they win. The episode aired 8 weeks later and became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's history, sparking national conversations about ALS awareness, family support systems, and the courage required to face terminal illness with dignity and grace. The response from viewers was overwhelming and deeply personal. Families dealing with ALS wrote to share how Robert's appearance had given them perspective and hope. NASCAR fans and automotive professionals honored Robert's legacy. Medical professionals praised the show for presenting terminal illness with dignity and grace rather than pity. But perhaps most significantly, Robert Turner became an unexpected symbol for ALS awareness.
His simple answer about missing one last drive with his sons became a rallying cry for families fighting against time to create meaningful memories.
Steve Harvey, who had built his career on making people laugh and bringing families together, learned something profound about the difference between entertainment and inspiration. In interviews afterward, he said, "Mr. Turner taught me that some victories aren't about crossing the finish line first. They're about how you run the race, how you treat your team, and how you handle it when things break down." The Turner family used their winnings to establish a fund for ALS research and to purchase adaptive equipment for Robert. But the real prize was something money couldn't buy, a perfect memory that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Robert Turner passed away peacefully 14 months after the Family Feud episode aired, surrounded by his 3 sons and their families. At his memorial service, over 500 people gathered to honor the man who had spent 40 years making cars run better and a lifetime teaching his sons how to be better men. Steve spoke at the memorial service, wearing a vintage Charlotte Motor Speedway crew shirt that David, Michael, and Christopher had given him. "Robert Turner taught me something I'll never forget," Steve told the gathered mourners. "He taught me that the fastest cars aren't necessarily the ones that cross the finish line first. The fastest cars are the ones that keep running long after the race is over, built with love, maintained with care, and driven by people who understand that winning isn't about beating everyone else, it's about giving everything you have for the people who matter most." The Robert Turner ALS Research Fund continues to this day, funded by donations from NASCAR fans, viewers moved by his story, and automotive professionals. The fund has contributed to research advances and provided support equipment for hundreds of ALS patients. Because sometimes the most powerful engines really are the ones that never stop running, even when everything else begins to fail. Robert Turner proved that victory laps don't require racetracks. They just require family, love, and the courage to keep moving forward. His final drive wasn't measured in miles per hour, but in the legacy he left in 3 sons, who learned that the best way to honor a champion is to keep racing with the same spirit and love he showed them. The Turner boys still watch NASCAR races together, and they still hear their father's voice in the sound of engines, the precision of pit stops, and the teamwork that makes victory possible. Because some teachers never really stop teaching, and some drivers never really stop racing, They just find new ways to show us what it means to run with heart, and always remember that the most important victory is the love you leave behind.